The R34 Nissan Skyline GTR makes 276 brake horsepower, except it doesn't. Oh, and the A80 Toyota Supra, 276 brake horsepower, but again, it doesn't. And then there's the Honda NSX, which makes, you guessed it, 276 brake horsepower, and of course, it doesn't. Welcome everyone to the frankly bizarre world of the 276 brake horsepower Japanese gentleman's agreement. Now, to find out where all this started, we have to go all the way back to the 1970s and the time of terrible wallpaper. Can we get rid of that wallpaper now, please? Yeah, thank you. It was in that decade that Japanese authorities were really starting to struggle with the rise of the Bōsōzoku. I probably pronounced that terribly, so please accept my apologies. Now, here in the West, a lot of people associate that name with wildly modified cars with crazy exhaust pipes that are very long and intricately designed. But actually, the word has some somewhat less innocent origins. The word actually means running wild and driving recklessly tribe. Now, you can think of it as Japan's answer to, say, the greasers of the US in the 1960s. And it was thought that at its peak there were tens of thousands of participants. Bōsōzoku was mostly focused on bike gangs, but there were some cars involved too. And for both the two and four-wheeled sides of it, violence tended to go hand in hand with quite a lot of speeding. And so one of the measures came from the Japan Automobile Manufacturers Association, or JAMA. Now, their solution was to impose a mandatory electronic speed limiter to all vehicles, be they bikes or cars, of 180 kilometers an hour. Now, that's 112 miles an hour in old money. Now, that 180k limit is still in place today, so if you want to go and import yourself a nice slice of JDM and forbidden fruit, that's something you're going to have to deal with, even if it's a very recent car. Now, 180 kilometers an hour is a far cry from the 250 kilometers an hour or 155 miles an hour electronic speed limiters that we're used to from the European manufacturers, and actually that's a kind of gentleman's agreement of its own, but probably something to talk about another day. So we had this 180k limit, but the thing is, road deaths in Japan were still soaring by the late 1980s. Something else had to be done. The JMA reared its head once more, but this time there was going to be a power limit to go with the speed limit. With a raft of extremely exciting new Japanese performance cars on the way around that time, it was the ideal moment to bring about a sort of gentleman's agreement between the likes of Subaru, Toyota, Mitsubishi, Nissan, Mazda, and Honda. At this point, I probably don't need to repeat myself and say what that power figure was, but just in case you weren't paying attention for the last few minutes, it was 276 brake horsepower or 280 horsepower. They're not the same thing. Google it. Now, the first car to stick to this rule was the Nissan 300ZX in its twin-turbo form. Buy one anywhere else in the world, say the US, and you had a 300 brake horsepower car. Buy a 300ZX in its native Japan, however, and yeah, 276 brake horsepower. And so if you wondered why you've heard that 276 brake horsepower figure so much, now you know. Some of the most iconic Japanese performance cars from the 1990s, yeah, they all produce, on paper, 276 brake. The thing is, this kind of looked increasingly silly over time. Spare a thought for the poor Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution. Now, from the Evo 4 right the way through to the Evo 8, yeah, 276 brake horsepower, no difference. That, on the face of it, doesn't really seem like it's doing much evolving, does it? It was the same again with its arch rival, the Subaru Impreza WRX STI, which again, 276 brake horsepower. For the Nissan Skyline GTR, it was a similar kind of story as it was for those Lancer Evolutions. R32, 33 and 34, it was becoming more and more sophisticated with every generation, with clever active yaw control systems and more and more complex four-wheel drive systems, but from that RB26 under the bonnet, still 276 brake horsepower all the way through. Even supercars were not immune. So the Honda NSX, yeah, it made 276 brake horsepower from its lovely high-revving V6. We can give you more examples as well. There's the Toyota Century. That had Japan's only production of V12, but all that displacement didn't matter. The factory figure was still 276. And then there's the Mazda RX-7, whose complex twin-turbo rotary engine could only muster, on paper, 276 brake. There are a couple of things we should bring up at this point. Now, firstly, as we kind of hinted at earlier, a lot of export versions would often have more power than they did domestically. Now, the second thing worth pointing out is there were a few exceptions, because special editions were often considered not part of the rules. So before you go in the comments and say, well, what about this one, what about that one? We've got you covered. One of those was the R33 Skyline GTR based Nismo 400R, which made, as the name implies, 400 horsepower or 395 brake horsepower, completely obliterating the 276 brake rule. The Subaru Impreza ST01 meanwhile also broke it, but not by quite as much. That was more like 300 horsepower, but still over the limit. But as far as the non-limited stuff goes, it was all 276, at least officially. Now you might have noticed throughout this video I keep saying things like on paper and according to the factory figures. There is a very good reason I keep saying stuff like that. And that's because the 276 brake horsepower limit was a big fat lie. It was widely known that that 276 brake horsepower unwritten rule wasn't really very closely adhered to. It's doubtful that many cars were sticking to that limit, and some of them were way past it. There's the R34 Skyline GTR. That was putting out 320, definitely not 276. And the Honda NSX, everyone knows that was putting out more than 300. Now I know that most of them were willfully ignoring that limit, but the thing is, on paper, their cars looked underpowered compared to the competition from Europe and the US. It just wasn't a good look when BMW were bringing out things like the E46 M3, and that did 338 brake horsepower. There were also fears that this limit would start to stifle engine development in Japan. After all, why would you spend loads of money developing a brand new engine only to have to say, oh, it makes 276 brake horsepower? Can you imagine if Lexus would have brought out its LFA with a 4.8 litre V10 and said, oh yeah, it makes 276 brake horsepower? It just wouldn't work. All the while, road deaths in Japan had actually started to drop quite significantly, and no, it probably didn't have much to do with those power limits. Instead, it was largely attributed to improvements in car safety, things like more and better airbags and improved crumple zones. The JAMA's then chairman, Itaru Koida, even went on record in July 2004 and said there wasn't really a clear link between speed and road deaths. By October of the same year, the agreement was breached. Now, you're probably thinking, what was this fire-breathing exotic to first do the deed? Well, it was a Honda legend. Yeah. Its twin-turbo V6 didn't exactly break the limit by much either. It made around 300 horsepower. Others soon followed. The Mitsubishi Evo 9 arrived in 2005, and again it didn't break the limit by masses. It made 284 from its 4G64 inline-4 turbo. However, it did not take long at all for other cars to arrive that would thoroughly all over that limit. Just look at the R35 Nissan GTR. That made 480 horsepower. And we talked about the LFA earlier. That did 563, more than double the old limit. A little more recently, we had the 573 brake horsepower second generation Honda NSX, and from the same company there's the Civic Type R. Now that's made over 300 horsepower for the last few generations now. Weirdly though, there is one car made by Japan that still makes bang on 276 brake horsepower. That's the updated version of the Toyota GR Yaris, although actually that's in Europe you get that power output, and it's all to do with some emissions stuff. Anyway, it's kind of hard to imagine that cars like the R35, like the LFA, like the second gen NSX even happening had that 276 brake horsepower limit stayed in place. Now I know that Japan has been a bit slower to jump on the EV bandwagon, but a slew of enormously fast electric cars is surely inevitable. I mean, Toyota, for example, are busy preparing a next generation LFA, and it's going to be all electric, and it really isn't hard to make a lot of power from some batteries and motors. A lot more than 276. Really, it was inevitable that that limit was going to go. It's just surprising that it took until 2004. Thank you very much for watching. Now don't forget to like and subscribe. There's some more videos here, and of course you can go to carthrottle.com for even more content.